Look at that filthy thing, someone call security before it begs for our table scraps." The three young women in designer coats laughed, sneering at the ragged man standing quietly outside Chicago's most exclusive restaurant. They saw a penniless beggar, dirty and beneath them, someone to mock on their way to brunch. What they didn't know, what nobody on that street knew, was that the man in the torn coat was Adrian Kane, 37 years old, the most feared crime boss in the city, a man whose fortune could have bought that entire restaurant and everyone laughing inside it. He owned half of Chicago. His name made grown men lower their eyes, yet here he stood in rags by his own choice, because every woman who'd ever smiled at him had asked the same questions first: which buildings, which islands, which diamonds, money first. The man himself, never. So he'd stripped away the watch, the suit, the power, and walked into the streets as a nobody, just to learn if a single soul could love the man beneath the money. He didn't expect much. He certainly didn't expect what happened the moment those three women opened their mouths, because someone was about to step in front of him and nobody saw it coming. If you believe real love can still find a man when he looks like he has nothing, do me a small favor, tap that like button, share this with someone who needs it today, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now, let's go back to the morning it all began. The early sunlight still wasn't warm enough to chase away the cold lingering on the sidewalk, and the laughter of the three young women was still hanging in the air when another voice cut through it, calm yet sharp as a blade. Mabel Hart stepped out through Rossi's side door, her apron still carrying the scent of coffee and flour, her worn heels tapping softly against the stone pavement. She had only just finished her morning shift, and her hands were still red from dishwater. But when she saw three women in expensive fur coats pointing and sneering at the ragged man pressed close to the wall, something inside her flared beyond restraint. She didn't stop to think. She simply walked forward and placed herself directly in front of Adrian, as though using her own body to form a wall between him and their contemptuous stares. Coraline arched an eyebrow, her gaze sweeping from the waitress's head to her feet, with unmistakable mockery, then remarked that the two of them must be the same kind of trash, since they both smelled alike. Mabel didn't blink. She said the only thing that stank there was the way the three of them spoke, and that a person could wear an entire store on her body and still reveal the poorest thing of all, the poverty of her soul. Whitney was left speechless for a second, her flawlessly made-up face flushing with humiliation, as several passing customers turned to look. She demanded through clenched teeth whether Mabel knew who she was speaking to, warning that one phone call would be enough to cost the waitress her job immediately. Mabel nodded, strangely composed, and replied that she knew exactly who she was, a waitress earning every honest dollar she had, and she also knew exactly who the three women were, people wealthy enough to buy the most expensive breakfast in the city, but not decent enough to afford even a little courtesy. Delphine, the quietest of the three, let out a scornful laugh and said that someone like Mabel would never understand their world. Mabel looked directly into her eyes and said she didn't need to understand a world where a person's worth was measured by the label inside a coat, and that when someone could stand beside a hungry man and do nothing but laugh at him, even the finest fur couldn't hide the emptiness within. The air around the restaurant entrance suddenly grew heavy. Several customers stopped walking, another employee leaned out to watch, and the three wealthy young women realized they were losing a battle they had believed was already theirs. Coraline jerked her handbag against her side and threw back a threat, saying that this wasn't over and that she would make Mabel pay, before all three turned sharply and marched inside with angry footsteps, leaving behind laughter that had died completely and an awkward silence in its place. Only then did Mabel turn to look at the man she had just defended. He stood there, taller and broader than she had expected beneath the torn coat, his face covered with uneven stubble and the dust of the streets, yet his eyes were so sharp and alert that she hesitated for the briefest moment. She didn't dwell on it. She only gave him a gentle smile and asked him to wait there for a little while. She went back inside, and when she returned, she carried a warm loaf of bread wrapped in a paper napkin and a cup of hot coffee she had paid for from her own pocket, using the loose change she had meant to save for her own lunch. She pressed them into his hands and told him he should eat something to warm his stomach, because Chicago mornings were colder than people realized. Adrian accepted them, and for a second, he couldn't speak. After a lifetime surrounded by power and money, accustomed to people bowing their heads out of fear or flattering him for personal gain, he had never known a woman who would step in front of him and risk her own job to defend a man she believed had nothing. She didn't know who he was. She didn't expect anything in return. She gave simply because she saw him as a human being. Adrian tightened his fingers around the coffee cup, warmth spreading through his frozen hands, and something inside his chest, something that had been sealed in ice for years, quietly cracked open. He thanked her, his voice rougher than he expected, and Mabel only gave a small nod before telling him he didn't need to thank her, because everyone deserved to be treated like a human being. Then she turned and went back inside, leaving him standing alone on a Chicago sidewalk, holding the bread of a poor young woman, and wondering for the first time in his life whether he had just stumbled upon the very thing he had spent an entire fortune trying to find. The morning shift had barely ended before Mabel had to start thinking about the evening one, because at Rossi's, someone like her was never allowed the luxury called rest. She stepped out through the side door, removed the stained apron, and stuffed it into her old, frayed handbag, then hurried toward the bus stop 3 blocks away, silently repeating the familiar numbers in her mind, numbers she knew so well they had become part of the rhythm of her breathing. The rent on their small apartment on the city's south side was nearly due, and she was still almost $200 short. The electric bill had been overdue for a week, and the payment notice taped to her door was something she had spent the last several days trying not to look at. Yet all those numbers seemed small beside the greatest one, the one that always pressed down heavily on her shoulders, the cost of each of her mother's dialysis treatments. Mrs. Hart had grown much weaker over the past 2 years. Both of her kidneys had nearly stopped working, and 3 times every week, Mabel took her mother to the dialysis center, sat beside her, watched the blood of the woman who had given her life flow through clear plastic tubes, then tried once again to calculate how much longer they could survive that month. Insurance covered only part of the expense. Everything else fell onto the shoulders of a 26-year-old waitress. When she reached home, she pushed open the wooden door that had warped from years of dampness and stepped into the apartment where a dark water stain spread across the ceiling whenever it rained, where the old heater worked only when it felt like it, and where the smell of mildew had become so familiar that she no longer noticed it. Her mother was lying on the worn couch beside the window, her face pale, though she still managed to smile when she saw her daughter come home. Mabel bent down and kissed her forehead, asked a few gentle questions, and hid the exhaustion in her own voice, because she knew the thing her mother feared most wasn't illness, but the feeling of becoming a burden. In the corner of the room, her 15-year-old brother, Toby, was bent over an old study table, the weak yellow light falling across the pages of his book. Toby was bright and did well in school. He was the only hope the entire family still held on to, and Mabel had made a promise to herself that even if she had to work until there was nothing left of her, she would never allow him to leave school halfway through the way she once had. She placed a carton of milk and half a loaf of discounted bread from the corner store on the table for him, told him to eat before he continued studying, then quietly went into the kitchen and warmed the thin soup left over from the day before, the evening meal for all 3 of them. She swallowed a few hurried spoonfuls, changed into another uniform for the night shift, and when she looked at herself in the cracked mirror hanging behind the bathroom door, she saw that the shadows beneath her eyes had grown darker and her shoulders had become thinner. Still, she only drew in a long breath and stepped back out into the cold. The evening shift at Rossi's was usually busier and more tense, and that night, just as she finished tying her apron, the manager, Mr. Foster, called her into the back office. He wasn't a cruel man, only a weary middle-aged one who lived in constant fear of offending wealthy customers, and he had already heard about what had happened that morning. He told her that the 3 women belonged to prominent families, that one of them had called to complain, and that if there was one more incident like it, he wouldn't be able to keep her employed. He lowered his voice and said he understood that she had her reasons, that he didn't entirely blame her, but in a place where everyone's wages depended on the wallets of the rich, sometimes a person had to swallow even their own decency. Mabel stood there in silence, listening with both hands clenched together behind her back, and she didn't argue, not because she believed she had been wrong, but because she understood exactly what losing that job would cost her. She simply nodded, offered the expected apology, and returned to the dining room, where crystal chandeliers sparkled above white tablecloths and customers who never once lifted their eyes to look at the people serving them. She worked through the entire evening with a polite smile fixed to her lips, pouring wine, clearing plates, bowing her head in thanks for the few small tips left behind, while the numbers continued circling through her mind without rest: the rent, the electricity, the medicine, and her mother's next dialysis appointment. And beneath the weight of all those burdens, the strange thing was that the only thought that made her heart feel a little lighter, the only thing that caused the faintest curve to touch her lips when no one was watching, was the memory of the ragged man from that morning, accepting the bread from her hands with an expression that made it seem as though no one had ever treated him with kindness before. That night, after returning to the temporary shelter Bishop had arranged for him, a cheap rented room on the north side of the city with stained walls and the sound of car horns drifting up from the street below, Adrian Kane sat on the edge of the iron bed, the loaf of bread now cold and still resting on the rickety wooden table, and he stared at it for a long time, as though it were the strangest object he had ever seen. In nearly 37 years of life, he had held nearly everything money could buy: contracts worth millions of dollars, keys to mansions and yachts, bottles of aged wines so expensive that a single one could support a family for an entire year, yet nothing had ever tightened his chest the way that inexpensive loaf of bread did, bought by a poor young woman with the loose change she had set aside for her own lunch. He thought about it, and in the stillness of that unfamiliar room, he allowed the thoughts he had avoided for so long to rise to the surface. Adrian hadn't been born into poverty, but he had never truly known warmth either. His father, the man who had built the empire Adrian now ruled, had taught him from an early age that trust was weakness, that affection was a luxury people in their position couldn't afford, and that at the top, a man always had to stand alone. Adrian had believed him. He had lived by those lessons, climbed all the way to the summit, and discovered that the old man had been right. It truly was cold there, and unbearably lonely. People entered his rooms wearing smiles, but he had learned to see through those smiles and recognize what lay beneath them: fear, greed, calculation. He became a master at reading people, and that very gift destroyed his ability to trust anyone. Every compliment he heard, he automatically translated into the real language hidden underneath, and nearly every time, that language carried only one meaning: they wanted something from him. He had lived inside that gilded prison for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as an ordinary human being, to be treated with kindness by someone who had no hidden motive. That was why, after too many sleepless nights spent looking down at the city from his penthouse, he had made a decision that anyone in his world would have called insane. He wanted to know whether affection could exist for the man he was rather than for the things he owned. He wanted to strip away the armor of power that had protected and imprisoned him, step into the world as a nobody, a man with nothing in his hands, and see how people would treat him when he was no longer the feared Adrian Kane, but only a bare and vulnerable human being standing among the crowd. He hadn't dared to hope for much. Deep inside, he had almost convinced himself that the experiment would only prove what he had suspected all along: that no one could love a man who had nothing to give, that unconditional kindness was only a fairy tale men like him were never meant to believe. He had prepared himself for contempt, rejection, and indifference, and that morning, when the 3 wealthy women had mocked him, he had felt only a familiar bitterness rise inside, as though the universe were confirming what he had known for years. But then that young woman appeared. She stepped in front of him, a complete stranger, risking her job to defend a man she believed had nothing, then buying him a loaf of bread with the little money she possessed. She didn't know who he was. She had nothing to gain from him, and that was precisely why her actions pierced every layer of armor he had built around himself over the years. Sitting in the darkness of the rented room, Adrian realized that for the first time in many years, he felt something almost like hope, something dangerous and fragile that he didn't dare name. And in that moment, he knew he wouldn't end the experiment. He had to know who she was. He had to know whether what he had witnessed was real, or whether it was only another illusion that would disappear the moment he reached for it. He would return to that restaurant. He would find that young woman, and this time, he told himself, he would allow his frozen heart to take one final risk, to understand how Adrian could vanish from his own world without anyone realizing it. One would have to go back several weeks, to the night he called the only man alive he still trusted. Bishop had served the Kane family for more than 20 years, beginning when he was still a young driver for Adrian's father, then gradually rising to become his right hand, the man who managed everything without ever asking unnecessary questions, the keeper of secrets that could bring an entire empire crashing down if they were ever exposed. At 52, his hair had begun to turn silver, and his face bore the deep lines of a man who had witnessed too much, but his eyes were still sharp, and his mind remained as clear as ever. When Adrian summoned him to the penthouse at midnight and explained his plan, Bishop stood in silence for a long while, as though he couldn't believe what he had heard. In a low, measured voice, he asked whether Adrian had truly just said that he wanted to disguise himself as a beggar and live on the streets. Adrian nodded. Bishop walked to the window, looked down at the glittering city below, then turned back, and for the first time in years, Adrian saw genuine concern appear on the face of that normally composed man. Bishop told him this wasn't a game, that at least half a dozen organizations in the city would pay any price for Adrian's head, and that the moment he stepped beyond the gates, without bodyguards, without an armored car, and without a weapon, he would become a defenseless target in a city filled with enemies. He spoke of the Rourke family, who had been quietly eating away at Kane territory for years, men who were waiting for the smallest sign of weakness before striking. He warned that if anything happened to Adrian out there, no one would be able to protect him, and the empire his father had built with blood would dissolve in a single night. Adrian listened to everything patiently and without interruption, then told Bishop in a quiet but unwavering voice that the empire itself, the very safety wrapped in gunfire and high walls, had turned him into a man so lonely that he was no longer certain whether he was still human. He said that perhaps standing at the very bottom, in a place where no one knew his name, would teach him what an entire lifetime of power had hidden from him. Bishop studied him for a long time, and in his eyes was a mixture of a father's worry and the understanding of a man who had known Adrian long enough to realize that once he had made a decision, no warning could change it. At last, Bishop sighed, nodded, and said that if this was truly what Adrian wanted, he would help him, but on one condition, that he be allowed to watch over Adrian secretly from a distance, so that if anything happened, at least one person would know where he was. Adrian agreed, and everything was arranged in silence. Bishop rented a cheap room on the north side under a false name, created false records for an unknown man with no past, and prepared everything Adrian would need to disappear from his former life without leaving a single trace. Then came the most difficult part, the transformation. Adrian removed his expensive, tailored suit, took the watch worth a fortune from his wrist, and stepped out of his polished leather shoes. He put on the old, worn clothing Bishop had found at a thrift store, a coat torn at the shoulder, shoes with thinning soles, and a faded wool cap. He stopped shaving and allowed rough stubble to cover the face that had always been meticulously groomed, let his hair grow unkempt, and allowed road dust and exhaustion to carve themselves into his appearance. When he finally stood before the mirror, even he had to pause. The man staring back at him looked unfamiliar, ragged, and weary, with no visible trace of the powerful crime lord who had once made an entire city hold its breath. And to Adrian, that was exactly what he needed. Bishop stood behind him, studying the reflection with an uneasiness he didn't put into words. He knew better than anyone what dangers waited outside. He knew the underworld never slept, and he knew that when a lion willingly shed its mane to move unnoticed among sheep, sometimes it was the wolves who benefited most. He said nothing more. He only checked the gun concealed beneath his coat and silently promised himself that he wouldn't take his eyes off Adrian for even a second, because a dark instinct warned him that this experiment would lead them both into places neither of them could possibly foresee. The next morning, Adrian returned to that street, and then he came back the morning after that, until standing close against the brick wall near the side entrance of Rossi's became part of the new rhythm of his life. At first, he told himself he was only there to observe, to understand whether the young woman who had defended him that day was truly as kind as he believed, or whether it had merely been a fleeting moment of impulse. But deep inside, he knew that wasn't the whole truth. Mabel recognized him the second time he appeared, and instead of looking uneasy or driving him away as he had half expected, she simply smiled and asked whether he had eaten anything. She began saving for him the food the kitchen discarded at the end of each shift. Loaves of bread that were still perfectly good but could no longer be sold, portions of leftover soup that would have been poured away anyway, and she gave them to him, not with the condescending air of someone bestowing charity from above, but with the natural ease of one human being sharing with another. On some mornings, before the restaurant opened, she sat beside him on the cold concrete step, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and they talked. She told him about the small details of her days, about the difficult customer from the night before, about her younger brother studying for his exams, about her dream of someday opening a little bakery of her own, even though she knew it was only a distant dream. She never asked where he had come from or how he had ended up this way, and when he hesitantly spoke about himself through fragments of stories that were half true and half invented, describing a man who had fallen on hard times and lost everything, she simply listened with gentle, unjudging eyes. Adrian, who had grown accustomed to every conversation being a silent negotiation, found himself unsettled by kindness that carried no calculation. Once, he tried to give her money, a banknote he had kept hidden, telling her he wanted to repay her for the bread and coffee. Mabel looked at the money, then at him, and gently pushed his hand away, saying that if he had money, he should keep it and use it to take care of himself, because she hadn't given him food in exchange for anything. She said it calmly, as though it were the most obvious truth in the world, and in that moment, Adrian thought of all the women who had surrounded him in his former life. Women whose every tender gesture had come attached to a price, women who always wanted to know what he could give them before they ever thought to ask who he was. The contrast sent an ache through his chest that was both sweet and painful. Day by day, the feeling between them deepened slowly and naturally, like grass growing after rain, without urgency and without noise. He learned the way she bit her lip when she was thinking, the way she laughed softly at his dry remarks, the way exhaustion shimmered in her eyes at the end of long days but never extinguished their warmth. She learned that beneath the torn coat and rough stubble, this man was strangely intelligent, measured in his speech, and sometimes capable of observations so sharp that they made her pause and wonder who he had truly been before misfortune brought him so low. But she didn't press him, because she understood that there were wounds people didn't wish to expose, and she respected that. One rainy afternoon, when he sat shivering beneath the awning, she removed her old scarf and gave it to him, saying that he needed it more than she did. Adrian took the scarf, still carrying her warmth and the faint trace of her scent, and he had to turn his face away so she wouldn't see what was happening in his eyes. From a distance, seated in a car parked across the street with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, Bishop silently watched everything. He saw the crime lord he had protected for so many years sitting on a dirty step, smiling at a poor waitress with a smile Bishop had never once seen on his face in 2 decades. And Bishop, a man who believed only in what could be calculated and controlled, felt something complicated and difficult to name stirring inside him. Relief that Adrian seemed to be finding something money had never been able to give him, and fear, because he knew better than anyone that in their world, the very thing that made a man vulnerable was also the thing that could be used to destroy him. He tightened his hands around the steering wheel, watched the 2 figures sitting together beneath the rain-soaked awning, and silently prayed that the fragile affection beginning to bloom between them wouldn't demand too high a price. The more time Adrian spent outside that restaurant, the more clearly he began to see a world he had never known before, a world that had always existed directly beneath his feet, but had been completely hidden behind the tinted windows of luxury cars and the walls of boardrooms high above the city. He began noticing people he once wouldn't have looked at twice. There was an older man named Walt who worked as a dishwasher in Rossi's kitchen. He was already past 60, yet he still had to stand beside a sink filled with scalding water for 10 hours every day because his meager pension wasn't enough to live on, and his hands were cracked and swollen from cleaning chemicals. There was a young woman named Rosa who waited tables while attending night classes, always hiding her tears behind a smile whenever customers berated her for no reason. Adrian watched the way Mr. participated. Foster deducted money from their wages whenever a plate was broken or an order was entered incorrectly. The way their already modest tips were divided into smaller and smaller portions, and the way these people had to lower their heads and endure customers who treated them as though they were invisible. One afternoon, he watched a well-dressed man knock a glass of wine across Mabel's apron, then shout at her as though she were the one at fault, ordering her to kneel and wipe the floor in front of him, while the others at his table laughed. Mabel obeyed without protest, her back bent low, but when she lifted her head, Adrian saw no weakness in her eyes. What he saw was a quiet, enduring dignity that no humiliation could ever touch. He clenched his hands until his knuckles turned white, and in that moment, the instincts of a powerful crime lord roared inside him, urging him to step forward and make that man pay. But Adrian forced himself to remain still. He swallowed his fury, and that helplessness taught him something an entire lifetime of power never had. He realized that this was what these people endured every day, not once and then never again, but repeatedly, day after day. They still had to smile, still had to lower their heads, still had to return to work the following morning, because behind them were children who needed food, bills that had to be paid, and loved ones lying sick in bed. He thought about his empire, about the buildings bearing the Kane name, and for the first time, he wondered how many people like Walt, Rosa, and Mabel were washing dishes and scrubbing floors inside those buildings, people whose existence he had never bothered to consider. He remembered how easily he signed reports calling for reductions in labor costs, without ever looking beyond the numbers to see how many lives they represented. How he had always regarded workers as lines on a payroll rather than living, breathing human beings carrying burdens of their own. One evening, after the shift had ended, he saw Mabel standing silently at the corner beneath a streetlight, counting her tips, and he realized that everything she had earned after an entire day of exhausting work was less than the amount he had once handed to a wine steward simply to appear generous at a party. The realization struck him like a blade. He thought of the women from his former world, women who could spend in a single afternoon of shopping what Walt would have to work an entire year to earn, and he saw the injustice of it laid bare before him, cruel and unmistakable in a way he had never allowed himself to see before. Yet what moved him most wasn't the poverty of these people, but the dignity they managed to preserve within it. Walt still sang softly while he washed dishes. Rosa still gave her own piece of bread to a homeless man sitting outside the door, and Mabel, though exhausted and struggling, could still buy a loaf of bread for someone she believed had nothing. Adrian realized that these people possessed a kind of wealth his entire fortune couldn't purchase. They were rich in kindness, in endurance, and in the ability to continue caring for others even when they themselves had almost nothing. And as he sat in the darkness at the end of the day, the man who had once measured the value of everything in money began to wonder whether, throughout all those years, he had been the poorest one of them all. It all happened late one night when Mabel finished her shift later than usual, and the alley behind the restaurant lay swallowed in darkness, faintly illuminated by a weak yellow lamp hanging crookedly against the damp brick wall. Adrian, as always, had remained nearby even after the restaurant had closed, and that was why he was the first to realize that something was wrong. Two unfamiliar men appeared at the far end of the alley, moving at an unhurried but deliberate pace, their cold eyes sweeping the surroundings like men accustomed to stalking their prey. Instincts sharpened through years in the underworld sent a chill across the back of Adrian's neck, because he recognized immediately the way they moved, the way they separated and positioned themselves on either side to block any retreat. These weren't petty thieves looking for a wallet. They were professionals testing the territory. One of them approached Mabel and stepped into her path, then began asking questions that sounded casual on the surface. Questions about the restaurant, about the customers who came there regularly, about a ragged man who often lingered nearby, and there was a veiled threat in his voice that made Mabel step backward, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. When she faltered and said she didn't know anything and only wanted to go home, the other man seized her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to make her cry out in pain. That was the moment Adrian no longer had time to think. The ragged man who always kept his head lowered and remained quietly in the background vanished, and in his place stood something entirely different. He crossed the alley in only a few strides, and before either man understood what was happening, he struck. Everything unfolded so quickly and cleanly that Mabel could barely follow it. She only saw him seize the wrist of the man holding her with one decisive motion that forced him to let go and stagger backward, then turn and avoid the second man's attack with the cold precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. There was no panic, none of the clumsy punching of a terrified man fighting for his life, only absolute control, every movement calculated, every blow aimed at the precise point that would disable an opponent without causing needless injury. In less than a minute, both men were on the ground, gasping and groaning, completely disoriented by the speed and skill of the man they had believed only moments earlier to be a helpless beggar. Adrian straightened, his breathing still steady, then looked down at them and spoke in a voice so low and cold that even he startled at the sound of it, the voice of the man he had always been beneath the torn coat, ordering them to get out and never let him see their faces near that place again. The two men struggled to their feet and disappeared into the darkness, leaving the alley utterly silent. Only then did Adrian remember that Mabel was still standing there, and he turned toward her. She stood, pressed against the wall, her eyes wide, one hand still cradling the arm that had been bruised by the man's grip. But what stopped Adrian wasn't the fear on her face. It was the confusion, the suspicion, slowly taking shape in her gaze. She looked at him as though she were seeing him clearly for the first time, and in a trembling voice, she said that a homeless man couldn't possibly fight like that what she had just witnessed wasn't the desperate self-defense of someone cornered by danger, but the skill of a man who had been professionally trained. Adrian felt his heart pound, not because of the fight, but because he knew he had exposed a fragment of his true self, and he had to think quickly. He lowered his voice, tried to settle once more into the weary manner she had come to know, and told her that he had once served in the military, that he had been stationed overseas, that it was a part of his life he didn't wish to discuss, and that the things his body had learned during those years couldn't be forgotten, no matter how far a man might fall. He lied as smoothly as he always had in his former world, But this time the lie left a bitter taste in his mouth. Mabel studied him for a long while, and he could see her thinking, trying to fit together the pieces of him that didn't quite match. At last, she nodded slowly and accepted his explanation, at least on the surface. But Adrian knew a seed of suspicion had been planted, and it wouldn't disappear easily. That night, as he walked her in silence to the entrance of her street, his mind was torn between two fears. The first was that Mabel had begun to suspect he wasn't the man she believed him to be. The second, far more dangerous, was the question of why their enemy's men were searching for a ragged stranger near the restaurant, as though they already knew that something unusual was concealed beneath the appearance of his poverty. After that night, something changed in the way Mabel looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and suspicion that she couldn't entirely set aside. She still brought him food and still sat beside him on the steps to talk, but from time to time, he caught her gaze lingering on his face longer than usual, as though she were trying to read something hidden beneath the surface. She began noticing small details she had overlooked before, the way his hands, though calloused, didn't bear the coarse scars of hard physical labor, the strangely refined way he held a cup of coffee, the moments when a trace of authority slipped into his voice, the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders rather than receiving them. Yet strangely, whenever her doubts began to rise, she remembered the look in his eyes when he accepted that first loaf of bread from her, remembered how he had turned his face away to hide his emotion when she gave him her scarf, and she realized that whatever he might be concealing, the loneliness inside him was real, and so was the way he treasured her kindness. So she chose to trust him, not because she was naive, but because she sensed that whoever he truly was, he wasn't a man who meant to harm her. One weekend evening, when the entire city was trapped beneath a cold, relentless rain and Mabel couldn't find a bus to take her home, Adrian suggested that they wait out the storm in a small late-night cafe on the corner. They sat across from each other at an old wooden table, steam rising from their cups of tea between them, and in that quiet place filled only with the sound of rain tapping against the windows, something between them slowly began to lower its defenses. Mabel told him about her father, who had died when she was 17, about the night she had been forced to leave school and find work to support her mother and younger brother, about the dreams she had quietly buried so she could carry the weight of her family, and she told him all of it not because she wanted pity, but because, for the first time in a very long while, she had found someone who truly listened. Adrian remained silent, and as he watched her speak beneath the warm yellow light, he felt something inside his chest break open completely. He realized that she had given him, a man she believed had nothing, something no one had ever given him before, complete trust without conditions, and in that moment, the burden of the lie he carried became almost unbearable. He began to speak, his voice growing rough, telling her that there were things about him she didn't know, things that might make her see him entirely differently if she ever learned the truth. Mabel looked up, and instead of pressing him for answers, she simply placed her hand over his, a small gesture so warm and gentle that it left him unable to speak. She said that everyone had a past, everyone had things they wished to hide, and that she didn't need to know who he had once been. She only cared about the man sitting before her now, the man who had risked himself to protect her in a dark alley, the man who had listened to her with his whole heart. She told him that, for her, it was enough. Adrian looked at her, and in that moment, the truth nearly escaped his lips. His real name, the empire he ruled, the reason he had wrapped himself in torn clothing and stepped into her world. He wanted her to know everything. He wanted to be himself before the one person who had finally seen him as a human being. But just as he prepared to speak, an icy fear closed around him. The fear that the moment he revealed the truth would also be the moment he lost this precious thing, that she would look at him differently, that she would see not the man she had slowly begun to care for, but a crime lord stained by blood and guilt, and he didn't have the courage to take that risk. So he swallowed the truth once more, and instead, he gently tightened his hand around hers and told her that she was the best thing that had come into his life in a very long time. That night, beneath the rain and the warm yellow light of the little cafe, two people from worlds separated by an immeasurable distance found each other in a rare moment of honesty, so close and so warm that neither of them wanted it to end. Yet even as Adrian held that moment like a treasure, deep inside him flickered an uneasy premonition that this fragile happiness had been built upon a lie, and every lie eventually demanded a price. That fragile happiness lasted only a few more brief days before the world Adrian had deliberately left behind reached out its hand and dragged him back. That fateful morning began with a phone call. The hidden phone Bishop had given him to use only in an emergency suddenly vibrated inside the pocket of his torn coat. And the moment Adrian saw the number on the screen, he knew something was wrong. Bishop's voice on the other end was tense and urgent in a way Adrian had never heard throughout all their years together. And what he said made the blood in Adrian's veins seem to freeze. The Rourke family had made their move. During the night, they had attacked one of the Kane family's most important facilities in the Harbor District. 3 of Adrian's men had been wounded, and cargo and property worth millions of dollars had been destroyed. And that was only the beginning. Worst of all, Bishop lowered his voice and said they had discovered where Margot, Adrian's mother, was living and had sent a message that couldn't be misunderstood, a direct threat against her life. In that instant, everything belonging to the ragged man who had lived on the edge of Rossi's for the past several weeks vanished. And Adrian Kane, the crime lord an entire city feared, came alive again in his eyes. He fired a series of short, cold questions at Bishop, his mind immediately shifting into the strategic calculation that years of power had turned into instinct. And Bishop answered that a car was already on its way to collect him, that Adrian had to abandon his disguise immediately, because the safety of the entire family and of his mother now depended on his return to take control. Adrian stood motionless in the middle of the familiar street, and for one brief second, amid the storm of duty and danger closing in around him, the first thought that crossed his mind wasn't of his empire or his enemies, but of Mabel. He thought of her, of the unspoken promise between them, of the fact that he hadn't yet told her the truth, and pain stabbed through his chest when he realized he was about to disappear from her life without saying goodbye. He looked toward the restaurant, where she should have been arriving to begin her morning shift, and a powerful urge rose inside him to run to her, to find her, to explain everything. But at that very moment, a polished black car pulled up beside the curb, the door opened, and Bishop stepped out with urgency carved deeply into his face, reminding Adrian that there was no time, that every second they remained, there was another second. His mother was in danger, that if Rourke discovered the head of the Kane family wandering exposed on the streets, the consequences would be impossible to contain, not only for Adrian but also for the young woman he cared about. Those final words stopped Adrian where he stood. He understood that if he went to Mabel now, if he allowed anyone to see the connection between them, he would unknowingly turn her into a target, a weakness his enemies could use against him. To protect her, he had to leave in silence. He had to let her believe he had abandoned her, rather than pull her into a world of blood and danger she knew nothing about. With a heart weighed down by grief, he stepped into the car, and when the door closed, cutting him off from that street, he felt as though the part of himself that had only just awakened was being suffocated once again. The car moved away and disappeared into the morning traffic, carrying Adrian Kane back to his empire, back to war, back to the man he had believed he could leave behind. A few minutes later, when Mabel arrived at the restaurant and instinctively looked toward the brick wall for the familiar figure, she found only an empty space. She waited for him throughout that morning, then through the afternoon, then through the days that followed, carrying food no one came to claim and sitting alone on the steps where they had once sat together. But the man never returned. He vanished into the air as though he had never existed, leaving her with 1,000 unanswered questions and a heart that slowly began to break beneath the weight of confusion, because she couldn't understand how the man who had looked at her with such longing in the cafe on that rainy night could leave her so suddenly and so cruelly, without an explanation, without a goodbye. The pain of being abandoned had barely begun to fade when disaster started crashing into Mabel's life one blow after another, as though fate had decided she wouldn't be granted even a moment to breathe. The 3 wealthy young women she had humiliated outside the restaurant that morning had never forgotten their grudge, and Coraline, the one who had warned that the matter wasn't over, had quietly waited for the right moment to take revenge. One evening, when the restaurant was packed with customers, Whitney, Delphine, and Coraline returned to Rossi's together, this time not to provoke her openly, but with a plan far more vicious. In the middle of dinner, Coraline suddenly raised an alarm, loudly claiming that her expensive diamond bracelet had disappeared, that it had still been on the table when Mabel came to clear the plates, and all 3 women immediately turned their eyes toward the waitress with blatant accusation. "Mr. Foster hurried over, and in the panic of the moment, when the 3 women insisted in unison that they had seen Mabel lingering near the bracelet, no one bothered to listen to her explanation. Her handbag was searched in the middle of the restaurant beneath the eyes of every diner, and then, through a scheme Mabel wouldn't fully understand until much later, the diamond bracelet was found inside one of its compartments. planted there by the hand of one of the three women who had arranged the entire performance. Mabel stood frozen. She stammered that she hadn't done it, that someone had set her up, but against the visible evidence and the testimony of three young women from prominent families, the word of a poor waitress carried no weight at all. Foster, though he may have had doubts deep inside, had no choice under the pressure of those powerful families and his fear of losing customers but to dismiss her immediately. He even threatened to call the police, and only through the reluctant intervention of several former co-workers, including Walt and Rosa, did she avoid being arrested. But the price was that she had to lower her head and leave the place where she had worked for years in humiliation, carrying the reputation of a thief. She walked through the restaurant doors for the final time beneath contemptuous stares, while the three wealthy women watched her leave with victorious smiles on their lips, finally repaying the humiliation they had suffered by destroying the life of the woman who had dared to stand up for what was right. Losing her job meant losing the only source of income her family had, and for Mabel, it wasn't merely a blow to her dignity. It was a death sentence for her gravely ill mother. Without wages and without tips, she had no way to pay for the regular dialysis treatments upon which her mother's life depended. She went everywhere she could, knocking on the doors of restaurants and stores in search of work, but word of the alleged theft had spread, and no one was willing to hire a woman who had been dismissed for stealing. While she was still desperately searching for a way out, her mother's health deteriorated rapidly. One night, Mrs. Hart suffered a critical episode, her body collapsing after too many missed dialysis treatments, and Mabel had to call an ambulance and rush her to the hospital. She sat awake through the night in the cold hallway, her face buried in her hands, while medical bills piled higher and higher, bills she knew she could never afford to pay. Toby, her younger brother, sat huddled beside her, trying to appear strong, though his narrow shoulders continued to tremble, and Mabel knew she was the only support either of them had, that she wasn't allowed to fall apart even as everything around her was collapsing. And during those long, exhausting nights, when she sat alone in the darkness, with the weight of the whole world pressing down on her shoulders, her thoughts returned again and again to the man who had disappeared. She thought of him with pain mixed with bitterness, wondering why he had abandoned her at the very moment she needed someone to lean on most, blaming herself for being naive enough to trust him and give her heart to a man whose real name she didn't even know. She had no idea that at that very moment, he too was drowning in a storm of his own, and that his disappearance hadn't been the betrayal she believed it was, but a painful sacrifice she would need a very long time to understand. Yet in that darkest hour, Mabel could see only that she was completely alone, abandoned by the entire world, carrying a dying mother, a younger brother who needed protection, and a broken heart she didn't know how to mend. Amid those accumulating days of darkness, Mabel began to realize that something about her body had changed. At first, she dismissed it, telling herself that the morning nausea and crushing exhaustion were only the consequences of stress and sleeplessness, of long nights spent awake beside her mother's hospital bed, and desperate days wandering from place to place in search of work. But when the symptoms continued and became harder to ignore, a cold suspicion began to stir within her. And finally, with the last few coins she had left, she bought a pregnancy test from the pharmacy on the corner. She sat inside the cramped bathroom of their leaking apartment, both hands trembling, and when two clear pink lines appeared before her eyes, the entire world around her seemed to stop. She was pregnant. She was carrying the child of the man who had disappeared, the man to whom she had given all her trust on that rainy night in the little cafe, the man whose real name she didn't even know. Mabel sank onto the cold tile floor, still clutching the test in her hand, and for one endless moment, she couldn't cry and couldn't think. She could only feel an immense wave of shock closing over her. She had lost her job, been branded a thief. Her mother was dying in a hospital beneath medical bills she couldn't afford. Her younger brother was still in school. And now, amid all those burdens, a tiny life was growing inside her, a life that would need to be loved, nourished, and protected in a world that seemed to have turned its back on her completely. Desperate thoughts passed briefly through her mind, easier ways out that her circumstances seemed determined to push her toward, and she couldn't deny that in her weakest moment, she considered them. But then her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, and something rose within her, something stronger than fear and despair. She thought of the baby, of how it was innocent of everything that had happened, of how, no matter who its father truly was or how he had abandoned her, it was still a part of her, her own flesh and blood, something beautiful born from one of the rare, honest moments of her life. Then she thought of her mother, of the strength with which that woman had raised Mabel and Toby for all those years with nothing but her own 2 hands after their father died, of the way she had never surrendered no matter how many blows life had struck against her. Mabel wiped away her tears, rose to her feet, and looked at herself in the cracked mirror hanging behind the door. She saw a woman who was exhausted and painfully thin, with dark circles beneath her eyes from too many sleepless nights. But within those eyes, a new determination had begun to burn. She told herself that she wouldn't collapse. She had survived her father's death, survived abandoning her own dreams, survived years of exhausting labor to keep her family from falling apart. And she would survive this too. She would give birth to the baby. She would find a way to raise it, support her younger brother, and care for her mother, even if it meant working twice as hard or 3 times as hard, even if it meant swallowing her pride and accepting the lowest jobs no one else wanted. She wouldn't allow herself to drown in bitterness toward the man who had left, because she understood that bitterness was a luxury she didn't have time to indulge. There were people who needed her, and she would be there for them. During the weeks that followed, Mabel kept her pregnancy hidden from her mother, unwilling to place another burden of worry upon her already fragile heart, and carried it silently by herself. She accepted any work she could find, cleaning houses, washing other people's clothes, working night shifts at a laundromat where no one asked questions about her past, and she worked until her feet were swollen and her back ached, saving every dollar she could. On some nights, she sat beside the window looking out over the cold city of Chicago, one hand resting on the small curve beginning to rise beneath her clothing, and softly whispered to her unborn child that no matter how cruel the world became, no matter what they had to endure, she would always remain beside it, and it would never have to feel abandoned the way she did now. And within that whisper, amid all the loneliness and hardship, lived a fierce love and a quiet strength that no betrayal or injustice could extinguish. The strength of a mother who had chosen to rise for her child when the whole world wanted to see her fall. While Mabel struggled with all her strength against the cruelties of her world, not far away in distance yet separated from her by an immeasurable gulf of fate, Adrian was being swept into a storm of his own. In the months after his return, he barely had a single moment of peace. The war with the Rourke family continued to escalate, and the relentless exchange of attacks between the 2 powers shook the entire Chicago underworld. Adrian was forced to devote every measure of his clarity and ruthlessness to protecting his empire and the people who belonged to it. He strengthened their defenses, tightened discipline within his ranks, moved his mother to a heavily guarded safe location, and step by step regained the advantage over his enemies. Yet even amid those cold, strategic calculations, the image of Mabel never stopped haunting him. Night after night, when the meetings were over and the penthouse fell silent, he stood beside the glass windows looking down over the city and thought of her, of the first loaf of bread, of the scarf that still carried her warmth, of the rainy night in the little cafe when he had almost told her the truth. He secretly sent people to search for her, the most trusted men he had, ordering them to find the waitress from Rossi's without revealing any connection to the Kane name. But what they brought back only made his heart heavier. Mabel had disappeared. His men reported that she had been fired from the restaurant over an alleged theft, that she had left her old apartment, and that no one knew where she had gone. The news of the theft left Adrian stunned, because he knew her well enough to understand that it couldn't possibly be true, that someone must have framed her. He ordered the search to intensify, but Chicago was vast, and a poor young woman with no status and no property could vanish into it as easily as a drop of water disappearing into the sea. With every day that passed without news of her, his torment deepened, because he knew that his sudden disappearance had helped push her into misery, that if he had stayed, if he had told her the truth, perhaps she wouldn't have been forced to endure everything alone. And while he was still drowning in that inner conflict, his mother appeared with a new kind of pressure. Margot Kane was a sharp and formidable woman who had built the empire beside her husband, and even now, at the age of 60, she still held great influence over the family's decisions. She saw that the war with Rourke was draining the strength of the Kane family, and she believed the only way to guarantee their survival was to secure a powerful alliance with another force. That force was the Vane family, a wealthy and influential dynasty, and the means of binding the 2 families together, according to Margot's cold calculations, was a marriage between Adrian and Celeste Vane, the proud and calculating 29-year-old daughter of that house. She presented the matter to Adrian not as a proposal, but almost as an order, reminding him of his duty as head of the family, of the need for personal feelings to yield to the survival of an entire empire and all the people who depended upon it, and of the fact that his father would never have hesitated before such a decision. Adrian listened to his mother with emptiness inside him. He didn't love Celeste. In fact, deep within himself, he felt a vague wariness toward the deliberate sweetness she displayed. But he couldn't find a reason strong enough to refuse, because the only woman his heart wanted had vanished without a trace, while his empire stood in danger, and hundreds of people depended on his leadership. He felt trapped between two crushing forces. On one side stood duty and the survival of everything his father had left behind. On the other was a love that had slipped from his grasp, one he didn't know whether he would ever find again. In that state of exhaustion and quiet despair, he didn't say no to the engagement. He didn't actively choose Celeste, and he didn't betray Mabel in his heart. He simply allowed the current of obligation to carry him away, agreeing reluctantly and coldly to let his mother arrange everything, while his soul still belonged entirely to a young woman wandering somewhere out in that frozen city, carrying within her a secret he knew nothing about. And so, the two people who had once found each other in the most honest moment of their lives were swept in opposite directions, each drowning in private suffering, divided by walls of class, secrecy, and schemes neither of them had yet fully seen. While Adrian reluctantly allowed the engagement to move forward, Bishop, with instincts sharpened by decades of suspicion in the underworld, couldn't shake the uneasiness that followed him whenever Celeste Vane was near. Something about the woman felt wrong to him, a smoothness that seemed too perfect in the way she always appeared at precisely the right moment, an excessive curiosity about details of the Kane family's operations that an ordinary future bride would have had no reason to care about, questions that sounded casual but always guided the conversation toward vulnerabilities, warehouses, and travel schedules. Bishop wasn't a man who acted on instinct alone, so he quietly began an investigation, secretly assigning men to follow Celeste and trace her connections without telling anyone. Not even Adrian. Patiently, he assembled each small fragment, following discreet meetings, cleverly disguised money transfers, and calls from unnamed numbers, until little by little, a horrifying picture emerged. One so disturbing that even Bishop, a man who had witnessed every kind of betrayal in his lifetime, felt a chill run down his spine. Celeste Vane wasn't an ally. She was a dagger planted directly inside the heart of the Kane family. Behind the polished appearance of a distinguished daughter of the Vane dynasty, she had secretly been working for the Rourke family for a long time, and the entire engagement, the very arrangement Margot believed would save the empire, was in truth a trap constructed with terrifying precision. Rourke's plan wasn't to defeat the Kane family through direct force, because they knew the cost of an all-out war would be too high. Instead, they intended to place an agent at the very center of their enemy's power, allowing her to become Adrian's wife, gain access to every secret, every asset, and every weakness of the family, then slowly rot and destroy everything from within. Yet what left Bishop utterly stunned, what forced him to sink into his chair when he finally connected the last piece, was a detail that had seemingly been forgotten. He discovered that Celeste herself, and no one else, had ordered the two unfamiliar men to appear in the alley behind Rossi's on that fateful night. It turned out that even while Adrian was still wearing torn clothing and living on the streets, Rourke's network had sensed that the head of the Kane family was behaving strangely, that he was frequently visiting a certain restaurant, and Celeste, who had been watching Adrian far more closely than anyone realized, had sent men to investigate what, or who, had captured his attention there. The two men who threatened Mabel in the alley that night hadn't been random scouts. They were Celeste's men, sent to investigate the very waitress Adrian cared about, and had Adrian not intervened in time, no one knew what they might have done to her. That realization cast the entire story in a completely different and far darker light. The enemy had known about Mabel from the beginning. They had already identified her as a potential weakness of Adrian's even before he himself understood how deeply he cared for her, and that meant the innocent young woman had been drawn into the dangers of a world she knew nothing about, simply because her kindness had touched a man who carried an entire hostile empire upon his shoulders. Bishop sat motionless for a long time with the files spread before him, weighing every possible next step with the caution of a man who knew that one small mistake could send them all to their deaths. He understood that if he exposed Celeste too quickly without a plan, she might strike first, she might warn Rourke, and the war could erupt in a form the Kane family wasn't prepared to face. He also understood that this news would strike Adrian like an earthquake, not only because it revealed a betrayal from inside their own house, but because it meant the woman he loved had been, and still was, in genuine danger. His face hardening with cold resolve, Bishop gathered every piece of evidence, secured it carefully, then rose and went to find Adrian, knowing that what he was about to reveal would completely change the balance of power and push all of them into the most dangerous game they had ever played. When Bishop presented all the evidence, Adrian sat motionless for a long time, and the emotions moving through him weren't an explosive rage, but a cold, calculating stillness, the very quality that had made him the most feared crime lord in the city. He revealed not even the slightest sign that he knew the truth, because he understood that his greatest advantage now was the fact that the enemy still believed its trap was working perfectly. He summoned his mother, and when Margot heard the full truth about the woman she herself had brought into their home, her face went pale with shock before hardening with fury. Not the fury of raised voices, but the frozen outrage of someone who had just realized she had nearly handed her family's empire to the enemy with her own hands. Mother and son devised a plan together, not to take revenge through violence, but to expose Celeste so completely that she would have no way to deny the truth and no chance to strike first. During the weeks that followed, Adrian played the role of the calm and distant future husband with flawless control, allowing Celeste to believe she was gradually reaching the secrets of the family, while in reality every piece of information he deliberately allowed to reach her was a carefully constructed lure. Bishop placed her every movement under close surveillance, recorded her secret phone calls, documented her meetings with Rourke operatives, gathered proof of the money the Rourke family had transferred to her in exchange for her betrayal, and link by link, the net tightened around Celeste without her realizing it. Once they possessed more than enough undeniable evidence, Adrian and Margot chose the moment to act. They arranged a formal gathering and invited the leaders of the Vane family, the distinguished dynasty whose name Celeste carried, under the pretense of discussing the marriage and the alliance between the two houses. Celeste entered the room with her usual confidence, believing she was advancing one step further in her plan, completely unaware that she was walking directly into a trap laid by the very prey she thought she had captured. In the middle of the meeting, before everyone present, Adrian calmly played the recordings, presented evidence of the financial transfers, and revealed documents exposing Celeste's connection to the Rourke family. The room fell silent. Celeste's face, always held under perfect control, shattered for the first time when she realized everything was over, that the man she believed she had deceived for months had seen through her all along and now held her entire fate in his hands. She tried to deny it and struggled to defend herself, but in the face of such undeniable evidence, every word she spoke became meaningless. Yet what truly destroyed Celeste wasn't Adrian's anger, but the reaction of her own family. The leaders of the Vane family, after witnessing her betrayal laid bare, didn't stand beside her. To people who lived in a world of power and negotiation, Celeste's actions weren't merely treachery, but a catastrophe of interests. She had dragged the entire family into a deadly gamble without permission, endangered its reputation and business dealings worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and now that the conspiracy had been exposed, she had become a toxic liability no one wanted near them. The head of the Vane family, with the cold calculation of a businessman weighing profit against loss, publicly declared that all ties with Celeste were severed, denied any responsibility for her actions, and withdrew every form of protection and every resource upon which she had depended. In a single moment, Celeste Vane went from a powerful heiress, a confident spy who believed she held the fate of an entire empire in her hands, to someone with nothing, abandoned by her own blood because she had become a burden and a threat to their common interests. Everything was stripped from her, her reputation, her status, her protection, and she was cast out of the world she had once believed she controlled, not by a bullet or a blow, but by something even more merciless in their world, the complete collapse of power and value. As she was escorted from the room, her eyes passed over Adrian with a mixture of hatred and terror, but he looked back at her only with the cold gaze of a man who had just pulled a knife from his own back. The trap had been dismantled. The dagger planted within the heart of the family had been removed. But Adrian knew this was only half the battle, because the true enemy behind everything, the Rourke family, still remained untouched outside those walls, and now that their peace had been exposed, the final confrontation between the two powers had become unavoidable. With Celeste's downfall, Adrian gained something even more valuable than victory, the key to destroying the Rourke family once and for all. For many nights, he sat with Bishop and reviewed the entire collection of evidence they had gathered, and he realized that the documents exposing Celeste's betrayal didn't merely condemn her, but had also unintentionally revealed an entire network of illegal Rourke operations. The payments Rourke had used to bribe Celeste had all left traces within the financial system, and by following those trails, Combining them with everything Bishop had quietly recorded from secret meetings and communications, Adrian saw the complete structure of his enemy's empire taking shape before him. Money laundering networks, shell companies, and illegal transactions spread throughout the city. That was when Adrian made a decision that the crime lords of his father's generation would never have dared to consider. A decision that broke every unwritten rule of the underworld in which he had spent his entire life. He wouldn't answer Rourke with violence. He wouldn't throw himself into a prolonged and bloody war only to leave both sides devastated while more innocent people were drawn into danger. Instead, he would use the law itself. The very weapon men like him had always tried to evade, to bring his enemy down. It was an extremely dangerous move, because handing evidence over to the authorities also meant walking along a razor-thin line. He would have to separate Rourke's operations from the darker parts of his own empire with extraordinary care, and he knew this was also the first step toward a much greater transformation that had already begun taking shape inside him. Through a trusted intermediary attorney and a series of carefully calculated measures designed to protect himself, Adrian transferred the entire file on the Rourke family's illegal operations to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The dossier had been prepared with near-perfect precision, containing complete evidence of money laundering, financial fraud, and numerous other crimes, more than enough to compel any prosecutor to act. Federal agents had pursued the Rourke family for years, without ever gathering sufficient evidence to bring charges, and now they suddenly found everything they needed placed directly into their hands, delivered anonymously, and impossible to trace back to its source. The investigation unfolded quietly, but swiftly and without mercy. Then one morning, while the Rourke family was still busy strengthening its forces in preparation for the street war it believed was coming, the strike arrived from a direction it had never anticipated. Federal agents raided multiple locations at once. Arrest warrants and search orders were executed across the city. Bank accounts were frozen, shell companies were exposed, and the leaders of the Rourke family, men who had spread fear for years, were led away one by one in handcuffs before the cameras of the press. The empire Rourke had spent years building, an empire no rival organization had been able to shake through force, collapsed within days beneath the weight of the law, destroyed from within by the very evidence of its own greed and betrayal. Furthermore, Adrian ensured that the truth behind the fake theft at Rossi's was exposed, forcing the restaurant manager to publicly clear Mabel's name and bringing legal accountability to the three socialites who had framed her. As news of Rourke's downfall spread, Adrian stood beside the glass windows of his penthouse and looked down over the city, and for the first time in months, he felt that the danger hanging over his family and over Mabel had finally been removed. His mother was safe, the empire had been protected, the enemy had been eliminated not through bloodshed, but through intelligence. Yet the victory left a strange emptiness inside him, because he realized that all the power, wisdom, and strategy that had allowed him to defeat a hostile empire had been completely useless in helping him find the woman he loved, the young woman who had vanished into the vastness of the city carrying a secret he still knew nothing about. And now, with the war over and no enemy left to threaten her, Adrian knew it was time to devote every remaining ounce of his strength to the one thing that mattered most: finding Mabel again and repairing what he had broken. Adrian devoted every resource at his disposal to the search, no longer forced to hide his efforts or remain wary of his enemies. And this time, through Bishop's tireless persistence and a vast network of information, the final clues gradually began to emerge. They followed the trail of a young woman who had taken scattered manual labor jobs across the city over the past several months, a name that appeared briefly in the records of a laundromat, then again in the files of a public hospital. And it was the news from that hospital that made Adrian's heart seem to stop, because it didn't merely tell him where Mabel was, but also revealed two truths he had never imagined. He rushed to the hospital in the middle of the night, disregarding every formality and every security precaution, and as he moved through the cold white corridors, with his heart pounding violently inside his chest, he was completely unprepared for what awaited him. He found her in a small room in the maternity ward, and the sight before him stopped him at the threshold, his entire body turning rigid. Mabel lay there, her face pale and utterly exhausted, but cradled in her arms was a tiny life wrapped in a thin blanket, a newborn child who had only just entered the world. Their child, she had endured childbirth alone, with no one beside her, and even more cruelly, Adrian understood from the hollow, tear-filled look in her eyes that during those same days, the mother whose life she had fought for so fiercely through all those years had finally passed away. Mrs. Hart had taken her final breath only a few days before the birth of her grandchild, leaving Mabel completely alone as grief and fragile happiness descended upon her at the same time. A young woman who had just lost her mother while becoming a mother herself, carrying both the weight of mourning and the responsibility of a new life upon her shoulders. Adrian stood there, and in that moment, all the strength, power, and coldness that had shaped him for so many years melted away completely, leaving behind only a man stripped bare by remorse and pain. Mabel looked up, and when her eyes met his, she didn't recognize him at first, because he was no longer the ragged man from the roadside, but someone dressed with quiet elegance, carrying an unfamiliar authority in every line of his body. Then she recognized those eyes, the eyes she would never forget, and her expression changed from confusion to shock before finally breaking open into fury mixed with all the pain she had held inside for months. Adrian stepped closer, and there, in the middle of that hospital room, he did something a man in his position had never done for anyone. He knelt beside her bed. Then he told her everything. He told her who he truly was, the name Adrian Kane, the empire he ruled, the reason he had dressed himself in torn clothing to search for something honest and real, and why he had been forced to disappear in silence on that fateful morning. Not because he had abandoned her, but because he had wanted to protect her from a world of danger she knew nothing about. He told her about the war, about the threat against his mother's life, about the enemies who had once searched for her, and about how he had spent months looking for her in desperation. Mabel listened to it all as tears streamed down her face. But they weren't only tears of relief. They were also the tears of a wound that had cut too deeply. In a trembling voice filled with anger, she told him that she had loved him when she believed he had nothing, that she had been ready to share her last loaf of bread with him, that she had given him the complete trust of someone who had nothing left to lose. Yet he had hidden an entire empire from her and left her to collapse alone, to lose her job, to lose her mother, to give birth by herself in the deepest loneliness without ever knowing who the man she loved truly was or where he had gone. She asked how she could ever trust him again, how she could know this wasn't simply another partial truth, and every word she spoke cut into Adrian like a blade, because he knew she had every right to be angry, that her pain was justified, and that no explanation could erase the months she had endured alone. He didn't try to defend himself or make excuses. He only lowered his head and said that he knew he didn't deserve her forgiveness now, that he hadn't come to demand that she forget everything, but only to beg for the chance to make amends, to remain beside her and their child, and to prove through actions, rather than words, that he would never leave them again. And in that cold hospital room, between the soft cries of the newborn child and the tears of two wounded people, no easy forgiveness was given. Only the fragile opening of a door, a painful beginning to the long journey of healing that still lay ahead. Adrian understood that once trust had been fractured, it couldn't be repaired with promises or money, and so he chose a path he had never walked before, the path of patience and humility. He didn't pressure Mabel to forgive him, nor did he demand that she immediately welcome him back into her life. He simply remained there, quietly and faithfully, day after day, proving himself through actions rather than words. The first thing he did was take care of every burden that had weighed upon her shoulders throughout those long months. He paid all the overwhelming hospital bills Mabel could never have afforded, not with the air of a wealthy man bestowing charity, but discreetly, as though it were simply his responsibility. He arranged her mother's funeral, a dignified and tender farewell worthy of Mrs. Hart after a lifetime of hardship, and throughout the service, he stood silently in the background, so Mabel could say goodbye to her mother without having to worry about anything else. He reached out to Toby, the younger brother who had forced himself to become strong for his sister during their darkest days, and arranged for the boy to return to school, to attend a good institution with every opportunity his family had once only dared to dream of, not as a way of purchasing their affection, but because he sincerely wanted that intelligent young man to have the future he deserved. Yet what gradually changed the way Mabel saw him wasn't his money or any of those arrangements, but the smaller and far more enduring things. Adrian, the powerful crime lord who made an entire city tremble, began appearing every day, not as a wealthy man dispensing favors, but as a father learning how to be a father. He stayed awake through long nights when the baby cried, awkwardly cradling the child in his arms with a tenderness he had never known he possessed, learning how to prepare formula, change diapers, and soothe his child to sleep. On some nights, Mabel woke and found him sitting beside the crib, softly humming a wordless melody to the baby drifting into sleep. And in those moments, the image of the frightening man she had heard so much about disappeared entirely, leaving only a father cherishing his child with his whole heart. He didn't avoid the humble or exhausting tasks, nor did he hand them over to servants. He did everything himself, because he understood that it was through those ordinary acts that his true presence would be proven. He learned to listen when Mabel needed to pour out her pain, and he also learned to remain silent when she needed space. He never dismissed her anger when it rose again, never told her to forget the past, but accepted it as part of the journey he had to walk with patience. Once, in a moment of deep hurt, Mabel spoke bitterly to him, saying she didn't know whether she would ever forget the feeling of being abandoned, telling him how fiercely she had hated him on certain nights, and Adrian only listened in silence without defending himself. Then he told her that he would spend the rest of his life becoming worthy of her forgiveness, no matter how long it took. Day after day, his patience slowly wore away the wall of ice that pain had built around Mabel's heart. She began noticing the way he looked at their child with eyes overflowing with love, the way he remembered the smallest things she had once told him about her dream of opening a bakery, the way he treated Toby like his own younger brother, and the way he hadn't been absent a single time since that night at the hospital. She realized that although this man had once deceived her about his identity, he had never deceived her about his feelings, that the tenderness he had shown her while wearing torn clothing had been real, and that same tenderness remained unchanged beneath the outer shell of power. She also gradually came to understand the true meaning behind his disappearance, understanding that it hadn't been abandonment, but a painful sacrifice made to keep her safe. That understanding didn't erase the hurt completely, but little by little, it began to heal it. And in the home now filled with the cries and laughter of a child, amid sleepless nights and weary yet warm mornings, two people once separated by secrets and fate slowly found their way back to each other. Not through the blazing moments of passion they had known at the beginning, but through something deeper and far more enduring, a love tested by loss, betrayal, and forgiveness. A love rebuilt one brick at a time through the sincerity of being present every single day. The time Adrian had spent on the streets in torn clothing changed him more deeply than he had ever realized, and now, with the danger behind him and his heart finally having found where it belonged, he began an even greater transformation. He couldn't continue being the man his father had created, couldn't return to ruling an empire stained with blood and darkness, while a child now rested in his arms and beside him stood the woman who had taught him the true meaning of dignity. Step by step, with the wisdom and caution of a man who understood every danger within the world he was leaving behind, Adrian began dismantling the darkest parts of the Kane Empire. He severed its illegal networks, shut down its underground operations, and redirected the family's vast resources into legitimate and transparent businesses. It wasn't an easy process, and there were people from his former world who resented the change, but Adrian was powerful enough and wise enough to carry it through without leaving a weakness behind, transforming an empire that had once spread fear into an honest business corporation that provided employment for thousands of people. Yet the most meaningful change he made came from everything he had witnessed during the days he lived among struggling workers and the poor. He never forgot the sight of Walt standing beside the kitchen sink with his cracked hands, Rosa hiding her tears behind a smile, and above all, Mabel buying him a loaf of bread with the last of her money. He remembered what it felt like to stand there in ragged clothing and be treated with contempt, to be regarded as invisible, as though a human being had no value simply because he appeared to possess nothing. From those memories, together with Mabel, he established a charitable foundation. It wasn't created to polish his reputation or cleanse his past, but grew from the very hardships both of them had endured and understood. Through the foundation, they helped homeless people, impoverished workers, forgotten by society, single mothers struggling to raise their children, and families unable to afford medical care for their loved ones, people living through the same circumstances Mabel herself had once faced. Adrian provided the resources, organizational structure, and vision, but Mabel was the heart of the foundation. She understood those people in a way money could never teach, because she had once been one of them. She had counted every coin, stayed awake through the night beside a loved one's hospital bed, and felt the cold sting of contempt. She treated every person who came to the foundation with respect and warmth, never allowing them to feel like beggars, always helping them preserve their dignity. As Adrian watched Mabel work, watched her hold the hand of a crying mother, or listen to the story of a homeless man with genuine attention, he became more certain than ever that this woman was the greatest blessing ever to enter his life, and that she, Not all his fortune was the one who had always been truly wealthy. Then one peaceful afternoon, as golden sunlight spread gently through the house now filled with laughter, Adrian decided to do what he had been carrying in his heart for a long time. He didn't arrange an extravagant proposal filled with diamonds and lights, because he understood that such displays belonged to the false language he had once fled. Instead, he went to Mabel quietly and simply, while their little child slept peacefully in a nearby crib, and he spoke to her with all the honesty a man who had once sealed away his heart could offer. He told her that when she first met him, she had loved him when he had nothing, and now he wanted to give her everything, not money or power, but truth, presence, and a love untouched by even the smallest lie. He told her that he had gone searching for genuine love among dust and contempt, and he had found it in the heart of a young woman who had defended him when the entire world had turned away. Then he asked her to grant him the honor of walking beside her for the rest of their lives, not as Adrian Kane, the crime lord, but simply as a man who loved her completely. Mabel looked at him for a long time, and in her eyes, Adrian saw everything they had endured together, the pain, the betrayal, the loss, and the forgiveness. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but this time, they were tears born from a deep and lasting peace. And when she softly said yes, it wasn't the innocent answer of a young woman experiencing love for the first time, but the complete and conscious choice of a woman who had seen both the darkness and the light within the man before her, and had chosen to remain. Many years had passed since that bitterly cold morning, when a powerful crime lord stood outside an elegant restaurant dressed in rags, and endured the contempt of the world. Now, on a late summer afternoon, Adrian sat on a wooden chair in the backyard of their home, and the scene surrounding him couldn't have been more different from the cold penthouse on the 60th floor where he had once stood alone, looking down over the city with an empty heart. There, he had possessed everything and still been lonely. Here, in a yard filled with golden sunlight, birdsong, and the scent of freshly cut grass, he had something his former fortune could never have purchased. On the lawn before him, their first child, now a little girl old enough to run on unsteady legs, was chasing a ball with clumsy steps, her bright laughter ringing through the air, and beside her was an even smaller life, their second child, whom Mabel had given birth to not long ago, sleeping peacefully in a cradle beneath the shade of a tree. Mabel sat nearby, her hair falling freely in the afternoon light, her face no longer marked by the dark circles and exhaustion of those desperate years, but glowing with a quiet peace. When she looked up and met his eyes, she smiled, the same simple and tender smile she had given him on the morning she placed that first loaf of bread into his hands. Adrian gazed at the scene, and in that tranquil moment, he fully understood a truth he had needed an entire painful journey to discover. The man who had once measured the value of everything in money, who had believed no one could love him without his wealth and power, now understood that the genuine love he had nearly lost was the greatest blessing of his life. He had searched for it in dust, humiliation, and the lowest places in society, and through some extraordinary turn of fate, he had found it not in wealth or status, but in the quiet heart of a woman who had loved him when he appeared to have nothing. He thought of everything they had endured together, of that loaf of bread, the dark alley, the rainy night in the little cafe, the losses and betrayals, the tears and forgiveness, and he understood that those wounds had forged a love stronger and more enduring than anything built upon ease. And now, with Mabel beside him and their children before him, Adrian knew he would spend the rest of his life feeling grateful for the day a poor young woman had stepped forward to shield him, and had seen the human being within him when the entire world saw only his ragged clothes. The story of Adrian and Mabel leaves us with a profound lesson that perhaps every one of us needs to be reminded of, that a person's true worth is never found in what they own, in the clothes they wear, or in the position they hold, but in their heart and in the way they treat those around them, especially the people society considers the least important. Kindness without conditions, and respect for every human being, regardless of wealth or poverty, are the true measures of character. And sometimes, one small act of kindness, one voice raised in defense at the right moment, one loaf of bread given without expecting anything in return, can change an entire life and bring light into the darkest place. If this story has touched your heart in any way, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video with your loved ones so we can continue listening together to more meaningful and captivating stories every day. We would truly love to hear how you feel about this story, what you think of Adrian and Mabel's journey, and whether you have ever witnessed or experienced a moment of kindness in your own life that restored your faith in human goodness. Please leave a comment below and share the sincere thoughts that come from deep within your heart, because your story may also become a source of inspiration and comfort for someone else who is listening. May today's story remind all of us to look at one another with understanding and appreciation, and to treat every person with compassion, because none of us can ever know that behind someone's outward appearance lies an entire story, a heart, and a dignity worthy of respect. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very final moment, and I wish everyone watching this video lasting health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next videos.